You're listening to the Fan to Fan podcast, and today we're talking about 90s TV superheroes. We're talking The Flash, Mantis, Nightman, and more. Here we go. Welcome to the Fan to Fan podcast. This is your host, Bernie Gonzalez, and I am here with good friend and fellow fan, Andre Walker. What's going on, Andre?
What's up, B?
So, today we are talking about superhero TV shows of the 90s. So I want to step back for a little bit. Superheroes have always been a staple of TV, from Lone Ranger, Zorro, Captain Video and the Video Rangers, Adventures of Superman, Green Hornet, the 66 Batman TV series, Greatest American Hero, Otto Man, remember that one? Mm-hmm. The Incredible Hulk, $6 Million Man, The Man from Atlantis, Wonder Woman, ISIS, and we can't forget Manimal, and the list goes on and on. But in this episode, we wanted to focus on some of the memorable and forgotten superhero TV shows of the 90s. We're not going to get into all of them. There was Nickelodeon's The Secret World of Alex Mack, The Crow Stairway to Heaven series. But we're going to be selfish, talk about a few that we remember, and some that we think should at least be mentioned because they've been easily forgotten. So Dre, let's start with the 90s Flash TV series.
1978, you believed a man could fly. 1989, The Dark Knight was reborn. Now, lightning strikes again. This fall on CBS, get ready for The Flash.
Based on the DC Comics character Barry Allen, or The Flash, a costume superhero crime fighter with superhuman speed, it was developed for a series in 1988 when Warner Brothers Television tried to develop TV films based on DC Comics characters for CBS. So do you remember the Flash TV series, Dre?
Boy, do I remember the Flash TV series, sir. That was one of my favorite action TV series of all time.
Really?
Yeah. Back in the day, when they did TV adaptations of certain characters, they kind of shortchanged you on some of the character, and he didn't really look like the character from the comic, and he kind of had powers similar to that character in the comic, but it wasn't really the same. I can go talk about the Daredevil movie, and the Hulk, and the Thor movie, and the Doctor Strange movie, and
the Doctor Strange movie.
The Doctor Strange movie. The Captain America, where he had the motorcycle helmet.
Oh, yes.
And he had the shield, and it was just like, what the? It kind of looks like Captain America from the neck down, but the motorcycle helmet. So they really didn't do a good job translating, but the Flash, the suit was... I remember the first time they showed the TV spot for the Flash TV series, and my jaw... And listen, I like the Flash. I'm a cool fan of the Flash, but I'm not like a... he's not Spider-Man or Batman or somebody like that, But I like the Flash. The Flash is a cool character. But when I saw the suit for the first time and they did the shot where it went down and it panned up and they showed the suit, and I was like, my God, it's an exact translation of the show. Of the comic. I can't believe they did an exact translation from the comic. So going into the show, they did a pretty great translation from the comic to the TV series. It was perfect, I guess, for the... his background was perfect for him being a
forensic scientist in Central City, for the Central City Police Department.
So he had the whole background that he was a cop and a superhero, so you can have the whole...
A procedural?
Procedural, thank you. He had the procedural type show, so you could hide the procedural type show in a superhero show, and that was the advantage the Flash had, because he was already a police officer. The fact that they did the costume, the visual effects were amazing.
Well, here, let me throw a bunch of facts at you. You ready for this one? All right, let me go to the suit. 4 body cast Flash suits were made for the series that starred John Wesley Shipp. And we got to talk about the cast, but we'll do that in a second. 4 suits were made. They cost a total of $100,000. The Flash's costume was designed and created by Robert Short and was built by Stan Winston Studios.
Did not know that.
Danny Elfman composed the series' title theme, and Shirley Walker composed the episode for each score with a full orchestra. And we know her because, well, she worked on Batman the Animated Series, the Superman Animated Series, the New Batman Adventures, Batman Beyond, and she kind of set the standard for that DC Animated Series universe. And she worked on a number of other series, live-action series like Falcon Crest, Space Above and Beyond, and China Beach. But I do remember the music, the title score, and how it was a terrific follow-up, especially after the 1989 Batman movie.
It was straight... it was a straight rip-off of the Batman theme song. If you heard it, you just could not think about... You couldn't help but think about the Batman movie with Tim Burton. And they went for that whole Tim Burton-esque world, too, with the way the visuals looked and some of the characters and some of the villains. And
it makes sense because the Flash series premiered September 1990, so a year after the Batman movie was released, the Tim Burton movie, and it ran for 22 episodes, so it was pretty respectable, all things being equal.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great series, and I know, I mean, just by what you talked about, how much the suit cost, it was canceled because of the budget, and it was just too expensive.
Well, the pilot episode had 125 special effects, and that's for the early 90s. It was a 2-hour pilot, and I remember that. It cost them $6 million to make versus subsequent episodes, which cost them under $2 million to produce, which is a lot for the 90s. I mean, we're talking 1990s on TV.
So, yeah, but it was a great, it was almost a perfect translation from the comic book to the screen. So that's one of my favorite adaptations of a superhero television series. And I think they did a great job. The visual effects are great. Like you said, we're going to get to the cast. Some of the casting choices was really cool. And it really fit into that action superhero genre, been better than most of the shows that came before or after it.
So let's talk about the cast a little bit. John Wesley Shipp was Barry Allen, or the Flash. You had Amanda Pays as Christina Tina McGee. So she was the scientist at Star Labs who provided the Flash with experimental inventions to adapt and overcome for all the enemies and learn about his powers. She was also the love interest. And the one thing I remember is that she had a pulp feel, kind of like a retro 30s, 40s, long tapered skirts, pleated slacks, and vests, which was an easy place to go for costume design. Because if you think about other superhero outings before The Flash, you had stuff like The Rocketeer and Dick Tracy. And even honestly, the 1989 Batman movie had this sort of perpetual era of like smoky Art Deco and Art Nouveau design. So it was a bit of a throwback, and she was a product of that.
Yeah, I mean, the whole world had that Art Deco design that they were trying to copy from the Batman movie. And it really gave the TV show a lot of more character and personality than your standard television series based off a comic book character. It was one of the shows that really stood out as a big game changer as far as adapting superhero TV shows to me, in my opinion.
So some of the villains, do you remember them? They had a few that they took directly from the comic book series. David Cassidy of the Partridge Family played the Mirror Master. Michael Campion played Captain Cold. Richard Burgi, who was the actor from The Sentinel, and he was in Desperate Housewives too. He played the deadly Nightshade. The Reanimator himself, Jeffrey Combs, portrayed a mob boss named Jimmy Swain. Denise Cosby, she was Tasha Yar from Star Trek The Next Generation, was Dr. Rebecca Frost. Bill Mumy, who played Will Robinson in Lost in Space, was Roger Braintree, this sort of eccentric, brilliant scientist who created a sound device capable of putting his targets in deep slumber. Mark Hamill was the Trickster. And they had other villains of the week like the Ghost. There was this android assassin named Omega. And then they had characters from the comics too that were allies for the Flash, like Iris West and Linda Park. So at least they mined the comics for some good material and some good villains.
The standout of that was Mark Hamill as Trickster.
By far.
He was the best. He was in, I think, 2 episodes, and both episodes were stood out as him being a poor man's Joker. Lo and behold, that later on he would be cast as the Joker in the Batman anime series using that same tone and voice. So if anything else, if only one thing you can remember from the Flash television series is that they gave us Mark Hamill as the Joker, that alone is enough to give the show a pat on the back. But it stood for 22 episodes. It stood on its own. There were some episodes here and there, like you say, like we always talk about, that were kind of like, okay, that was hit or miss. But for the majority of it, it was a good, solid superhero-based television series.
Yeah, the series didn't last very long. You said 22 episodes, so they didn't really have enough time for the Rogues Gallery to team up, and that's something that has been kind of a staple in the Flash comic series, and even in the recent new CW series. But I was reading that if the series had gone for a second season, that's exactly what the producers would have done. They would have put together the Flash Rogues Gallery, but the show fell victim to poor ratings. It was actually going against The Cosby Show and The Simpsons, which Fox had moved from Sundays to Thursdays, and CBS put The Flash on Thursdays in the hopes of drawing a younger audience, but that did not pan out.
Blow off. Cosby. Run away. Somebody else! From another repeat of The Simpsons. And catch The Flash Thursday.
I think one of the cool things too now looking back is seeing how that show really did change the way you thought about a quality superhero show. And it changed it so much that, like you said, in the new Flash television series, they pay homage to that Flash show by having a lot of the cast members from that show either reprise their roles, as Tina McGee returns as her similar character in the new series. Trickster, Mark Hamill reprised his role as the Trickster in the new television series. And they brought a lot of the people who play, even Julio, Barry's lab assistant sidekick, made an appearance this season as a Netherworld cop in a different parallel world, which I thought was pretty cool. So,
and in the original series, he played, was it Alex? He was the scientist who was Barry's coworker and close friend. So yeah, exactly. It was kind of neat to just see a nod to what the CBS series was in the 90s.
Yeah. So that just tells you how much impactful that show was, that they still wanted to pay homage to that show and what that show laid the tracks for the modern shows today.
Andre and I will continue our conversation on 90s TV superheroes in a second, but in the meantime, remember you can find the Fan to Fan podcast at www.fanpodcast.com. Facebook, just search Fan to Fan Podcast. That's FAN, the number 2, FAN, or on Twitter at Fan to Fan Podcast. I'd love to hear from you, so reach out, send the message, and let me know what you think of the show. Thanks.
And now, on with the show.
All right, so a show that maybe wasn't as impactful, Dre, but we have to talk about it, is Nightman.
So bad.
But we got to talk about it.
So bad.
It aired in syndication from September 97 to May of 99. I remember watching it on WGN. It was based on the Nightman comic book published by Malibu Comics, which was later purchased by Marvel Comics through the Ultraverse imprint. He was created by Steve Englehart. Nightman was developed for TV by Glenn Larson, who also brought us the joy of Manimal. Manimal's going to come up a few times in this one.
Johnny Domino was one of San Francisco's hottest young jazz musicians. But fate and a cosmic event were about to change his life forever. What the doctors told him seemed impossible.
John, your brain has managed to acquire the capacity to pick up certain frequencies like a radio.
But Doc, I'm all hearing bad stuff.
Yes, exactly. You're tuned to the frequency of evil.
The show starred Matt McComb as Nightman, a superhero whose real name was Johnny Domino, a saxophonist who is accidentally struck by a lightning bolt in a freak cable car accident. The strike allows him to telepathically recognize evil, but robs him of the ability to sleep, thus Nightman. He has no other superhuman powers on his own, but he does own a special bulletproof bodysuit that gives him several abilities, including the ability to fly very stiffly, holographic camouflage style invisibility, and advanced sight functions through this very red lens that he had over his left eye that gave him the ability to see in the dark and fire, of course, a laser beam. He also had the car, incredibly and unnecessarily stylish Chrysler that was kind of like this hot rod that he called the Purple Prowler. So, Dre, of course you remember Nightman.
I remember Nightman. Nightman was a hot mess. You know, even back then, it's not one of those shows that you look at today and like, wow, this was really cheesy. Back then, Nightman was considered like just cheesy,
which is to say something for the early 90s.
But I remember it, and I watched it, of course, because I'm a nerd, and I like those nerdy shows, but it was really bad. The flying scenes were horrible. The suit really didn't make any sense. It didn't really look all that good. The fact that he was a jazz player. And
some of the villains were just as cheesy as The Flash, because he had the villains of the week that included a evil scientist, you had the drug dealers, the mob bosses, the crime syndicates. There were a few superpower baddies like Rachel Lang, the hypnotizing villainess, Chrome, the villain who had telekinetic powers that had the same abilities thanks to the same lightning bolt that gave Nightman his powers, Selene, the mysterious witch, Chang, the evil Chinese diplomat whose goal was to cause another Third World War using like this neutron cannon. There was a bad vigilante named the Black Knight. There was a genetically altered assassin named Slade. In one episode, Nightman fought a vampire. There was an even episode in the second season where an alien crash landed outside of Bay City. This is the thing, as cheesy as Nightman was, and dear Lord, it was incredibly cheesy, but it ran for 2 seasons for 44 episodes. Twice as long as The Flash.
It was on syndication, and it came at that time when there wasn't really a lot of superhero shows out there for guys like me. So you take what you can get. You watch it and you shake your head and say, maybe there could be some potential here, but you know what? You're just grateful that something is on that's not Falcon Crest or Dynasty.
Yeah.
So that's...
It had a silly premise, visibly low budget. The second season was shot in the filming mecca where all TV shows shot in the 90s. Vancouver, Canada. And did you know, Dre, Little Richard, Jerry Springer, and Donald Trump actually made special appearances as themselves on the show. And in one episode titled Manimal, Nightman actually partners up with Professor Jonathan Chase, who was the star of the short-lived 80s series Manimal.
It's funny. I remember the Jerry Springer. I remember the Little Richard. I don't remember the Manimal team up.
Like I said, everything revolves around Manimal. All right, you ready for another 90s superhero series that you may have forgotten? Actually, you may not have forgotten because you kind of remember a lot of these.
Let's go.
Mantis.
I remember Mantis.
He's a brilliant scientist with a dream.
I want to walk again.
But what he becomes will defy imagination.
What are you, man?
From the writer of Batman and the director of Darkman.
Put all your money and jewels in the bag.
You won't win.
Comes a new breed of superhero.
Who are you?
Call me the Mantis.
I like Mantis. Mantis was cool.
And it aired on Fox in August of 94 when it premiered, all the way through March of 95. The original 2-hour pilot was produced by Sam Raimi, who I can only imagine was involved because of the 1990 film he directed, Darkman, because it was well before he directed the 2002 Spider-Man film. Mantis ran for 22 episodes, starred Carl Lumbly as a wealthy, mild-mannered Dr. Miles Hawkins, who was shot in the spine during a riot, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. And after losing a lawsuit against a police officer that he holds responsible, he uses his company's resources to invent a powered exoskeleton that not only gives him the ability to walk, but also gives him superhuman abilities. And not just that, Dre, using a vast array of technology, including a large underwater lab, a hovercraft that he called the Chrysalid, that he used to fly around the city. Using all that, he assumes the persona of Mantis, which is an acronym for Mechanically Augmented Neurotransmitter Interception System. You gotta love those acronyms.
I love this show. I did. I thought this show was a perfect blend of comic book lore and TV show fantasy. The origin story is like something that you could see a superhero. Basically, they took the Iron Man storyline and they gave it a urban feel to it with him being a scientist. He was a weapon. He was basically a black Tony Stark.
And I think it may have been the first black TV superhero series.
I think it was like the only black lead superheroes. I was talking with my brother the other day. We were talking about TV shows and stuff, and I was like, I think Mantis may have been the only superhero show that had an African American or any minority in the lead.
And they had a number of different minorities in there, like Gina Torres was actually
she was in the pilot,
and she played a pathologist. But they surrounded him with a number of different people, and his bad guy was an industrialist, Solomon Box, that was played by Andrew Robinson, who kind of played like this very wealthy 90s type of villain. But it was a product of the time, right? Like he fought the mad scientist, a deranged magician, a criminal with super speed, an evil supercomputer. Do you remember the series finale?
Well, it wasn't a time travel episode, was it?
It was indeed. Yeah.
What's funny? I think that was like the season finale for The Flash too, where there was an episode where Barry accidentally went too fast and went into the future, and where the Flash had disappeared. And I remember it because I remember when Mantis did the same thing. Like, wait a minute, it's the same storyline from The Flash. He went into the future where Mantis disappeared or something like that.
And he fought a supercomputer that was made from the technology that he had created in the past, and now it's become this supercomputer dictator. He ends up getting killed along with his police department confidant, Lieutenant Maxwell, and they get killed fighting, of course, an invisible prehistoric dinosaur. It was the 90s, and they set up like this time travel loophole where it could potentially return, but Fox pulled the plug. Mantis has a special place in my heart, because I do remember recording the show, because this is a time when on-demand DVR didn't exist. So you recorded the show, I would sit there, edit out the commercials, watch it with my brother before the new episode aired again on Friday nights, which was, and I still probably think remains, a place for Fox to throw a lot of their genre shows on. Everything, X-Files started there, but shows like Millennium, VR5, I mean, the list goes on and on. Almost Human. Mantis was a part of that. So there's a nice cheesiness to it, but at a time when superheroes are on our TVs, at the movie theaters, and comics are making a nice resurgence in pop culture, you gotta give some love to Mantis.
Yeah. And also, I don't know if you were going to mention it, but the lead actor, Carl Lumbly, is also better known for playing John Jones in the Justice League animated series Martian Manhunter. He was great. He had that voice. He had that presence. He basically was Iron Man and Martian Manhunter and wrapped up into one. It was.
I wonder if Carl Lumbly, when he goes to comic conventions, if there's always that one person that wants him to sign a print of him as Mantis instead of as the Martian Manhunter.
You know, it would be cool too, because like we said, that's pretty. I mean, you don't really what we said earlier. It should not be just thrown aside. That it was like to this day the only African American or minority character to be a lead in a superhero show. I mean, right now, like Luke Cage, you know, that finally broke that mold. But that's what got me and my brother talking about it. I believe it was when Luke Cage came out. Like, who else has there been an African American? There haven't never been Hispanic or.
You think of like
Latin.
CW. I mean, we've seen Smallville, and that one is part of a more of like the aughts, right? So it's not really for this series, for this episode. But if you think about all the CW shows that have been released, the Netflix shows and everything, I guess TV shows like our culture has progressed, and now we are seeing more minority characters. But for the most part, they kind of become part of the supporting cast. They're the friends, the police officers, the funny sidekicks, and they become cast as that. And Mantis was the first time that you saw not only an African-American actor, but he was a wealthy doctor.
Exactly.
And he was an intelligent, wealthy doctor that may have been, like you said, basically a black Tony Stark that made all this great technology, and it was just an aside that he happened to be African American. It didn't matter, but it's funny to think that Mantis would be a step forward in casting for, you know, it's maybe not it's not a touchstone that we remember, but it's something that, like you mentioned, you were just talking about it with your brother, so it's not forgotten.
So and on side note, I do believe that Linda Carter is biracial. I think she's white and Hispanic. So I don't. Just in case that this comes out and somebody says, "Hey, you know Linda Carter," so just in case, I think she is.
That's why it's called the Fan to Fan podcast and not the politically correct podcast.
Okay, so but it's very lacking in the minority superheroes, and Mantis was one of the first and one of the few, so he has a special place for me because of that.
One that does not have a special place for you, and I almost guarantee this, is the 1996 made-for-TV movie Generation X. Yes.
Fox presents a world premiere motion picture from the creators of the hit comic book series The X-Men comes Generation X. They've got the power. They've got the technology. They're the new generation of superheroes, and they're coming to save the world. Get ready for Generation X.
It was based on the Marvel comic book series Generation X, which was a spin-off of the X-Men, a franchise created by Scott Lobdell and Chris Bachalo, produced by New World Entertainment and Marvel Entertainment, and it was really essentially a backdoor pilot that starred Sean Cassidy as the Banshee, who was played by Jeremy Ratchford, who I did not know actually provided the voice for Banshee in the 90s X-Men cartoon.
I didn't know that either.
He had a really bad Irish accent in the series, and his power was the sonic scream. And then the other leader of this team that we'll kind of talk about in a second here was Emma Frost, a.k.a. the White Queen, and she was played by General Hospital actress Fiona Hughes, and she had the power of mind control. The two of them were the leaders of this Generation X X-Men type team that were a part of Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters, but without the Professor X. So, Jay, do you remember watching this made-for-TV movie?
I remember it sucked. I just remember watching it, and as I said with The Flash, the reason why I got such a Jones going on for The Flash, because they did such an accurate portrayal of the character from the comic. Even though I was not a huge fan of The Flash, the fact that they did him right made me happy. This is the other side of the spectrum, where they took characters from the and to be fair, they took really crappy characters too and tried to adapt them. So
let's start with Jubilee. Jubilee is played by Heather McComb, and she has the ability to generate brightly colored bursts of plasma energy, just like she can in the comics. There was Skin, who was played by Augustin Rodriguez, and he could stretch his skin in a variety of ways. And then they were recruited by Banshee and White Queen, but the existing members of Generation X, the team, were M, who was played by actress Amaryllis, who had super intelligence, enhanced physical abilities, and level 8 invulnerability, as I say with podcast air quotes. There was Mondo, who was played by Bumper Robinson. He was the team's hothead, had the ability to take on the properties of any organic or inorganic matter.
Mm-hmm.
There was Buff, played by Suzanne Davis. She had super strength, and she replaced Husk from the comics.
Yes.
Because it was way too expensive to do that for a made-for-TV movie.
Mm-hmm.
Then you had Refrax, who was played by Randall Slavin, who was the team's jokester, and his eyes could emit radiation, giving him X-ray vision and heat beams, and he replaced Chamber, because again, his powers would be too expensive to create for TV on a made-for-TV budget.
The only thing I barely remember about the cast was Bumper Johnson, because I know he went on to do like a lot of voice work in cartoons. He's on the Avengers, the new Avengers show as Falcon. He does a voice in Ben 10 as Rook. He's really popular at doing like animated voices, so I remember him because I remember, hey, it's the guy from Generation X. But I barely remember the cast. I kind of remember the woman who played M. Frost.
Do you remember the villain?
No.
Okay, so before her teaching duties, Emma, in the movie, worked as a researcher on a project to develop a dream machine to access the dream dimension. But she became in conflict with her fellow researcher, Russell Tresh, who was the bad guy. And he was played by Matt Frewer, who was in Lawnmower Man 2. He was Max Headroom. And he hammed it up as a mad scientist who wanted to return to the dream dimension that just looked suspiciously like Hellraiser 2. There were a few nods to the comics. They suggested that the White Queen had trained another group of mutants called the Hellions, who were lost, and she kind of blamed herself. They talk about the Mutant Registration Act. The start of the movie actually had that quote that's now been emulated in all the X-Men theatrical films with the definition of mutation.
Mm-hmm.
The mansion that was used for the Xavier Institute is Hatley Castle, which was also used as Xavier School in X-Men, X2, X-Men United, and X-Men The Last Stand.
Mm-hmm.
It served as the mansion for the Luthor family in Smallville and the Queen family in the Arrow TV series.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth mentioning, but it was definitely another product of the 90s. It was written by Eric Blankety, who worked on 21 Jump Street. Talk about product of the 90s or the late 80s.
Oh my God.
It was directed by Jack Shoulder, who directed A Nightmare on Elm Street 2.
I was going to say, it had to be 2. It wouldn't have been 1. It had to be 2. That's the one that 2.
That's right. Had low budget, which was apparent because it had bad CGI portrayal of all the mutant powers. All the kids wore those cool 90s clothes, talked in the cool 90s slang, and the show just felt like a X-Men version of 90210 or Saved by the Bell. But I think probably the worst thing is that it never turned into an actual series, which is what they wanted. They actually wanted to use this as a backdoor pilot to a Generation X TV show, but maybe the saving grace is the fact that only 4 years later, so to think that in 1996 this movie comes out that's completely forgettable, right? But then 4 years later, the first X-Men movie is released. So either they felt they had something in Generation X, but gave it up in order to make the movie, or Generation X was a perfect example of what not to do, and then that's why they did a more mature version of the X-Men in 2000 thanks to Bryan Singer. So if anything, it's at least worth mentioning that Generation X was released in 1996, and that's probably all that matters.
Yeah, that's all you have to say about that.
Yep.
In just a few seconds, Andre and I will conclude our conversation on 90s TV superheroes. But in the meantime, if you are listening on iTunes, please take a moment to rate and review. Just search for the Fan to Fan podcast, go on to reviews, enter a star rating, or write a review if you have a second or two, and click send. That's how easy it is. I will greatly appreciate it. Thanks.
So there are a few other series in the 90s that you are a fan of, Dre. So I'm just going to go through the list here because...
I didn't say I was a fan of. I said I saw them.
That you saw them. All right, so let's be clear. So there were a lot of series in the 90s that featured superheroes. We mentioned The Flash. There was Super Force. One that ran from 90 to 93 was Swamp Thing.
The swamp is my world. It is who I am. It is what I am. I was once a man. I know the evil men do. Do not bring your evil here. I warn you. Beware the wrath of Swamp Thing.
Remember that one? It aired on USA?
Yes, I do remember Swamp Thing. I was a fan of the first Swamp Thing movie. I thought it was a great cult movie directed by Wes Craven. It was a really low budget, bad effects, 80s movie, but something about the movie has some heart.
Especially with Adrienne Barbeau in there. I had a thing for Adrienne Barbeau after The Fog.
I loved her in Escape from New York. It had Ray Wise as Alec, and he was great. A great 80s actor, villain in RoboCop. I love the movie. And so when they announced that they were doing a TV series, I couldn't wait. The TV series was a drag. It was slow. It was boring. Swamp Thing never did anything but stand in the swamp and talk. It was just a boring, horrible TV series. The only saving grace that I believe the actor Dick Durek, they got the same actor from the movie to reprise his role in the TV series, so it had that consistency because I liked his performance as Swamp Thing. But other than that, it was a long, boring, nothing TV series.
It aired July 1990, ran through 1993 for a total of 72 episodes. Each episode was only 30 minutes long, so it didn't even get the full full hour like Mantis or anything else.
It was a half-hour episode, and even a half hour, they still found a way to drag it out, and nothing ever happened, and it was just so boring.
All right, so let's move on to another one that's maybe a bit more interesting than Swamp Thing. Let's go to Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, aired on ABC from 93 to 97, but that one was more of a pop culture TV series than some of these others that kind of were more genre type series.
Yeah, that was basically a rom-com. It was a rom-com TV series. You know, guy meets girl.
Just so happens that guy is Superman.
Yeah, it just so happens the guy is Superman. So they took a different tone with that superhero TV series where it was a superhero TV series in name alone, but it was more of a romantic comedy, sort of like Moonlighting. Basically, that's what it was Moonlighting, the TV series.
Kind of a love triangle between Superman, Clark Kent, and Lois, who obviously didn't know that they were one and the same. And they had Lex Luthor in there. They worked at the Daily Planet. They lived in the city of Metropolis. So a lot of the Superman staples were a part of the series.
Yeah, it was a decent show. It was a decent show. I watched it, I watched it at the time. I thought Dean Cain was a solid Superman. He gave a great performance, had a great look, and he filled the suit out. He had a great persona. And I thought Terry Hatcher was a really good Lois Lane. She was actually more of a Lois Lane than Margot Kidder, who I love. I love Margot Kidder, but she was a little bit more plucky, a little bit more likable than the Lois Lane in the movies, even though I love the Lois Lane from the movie. So I thought she did a really great job of playing that Lois Lane character. And
it was respectable. 4 seasons, 87 episodes. But I think the one thing this show did that some of the others didn't, it brought in a female audience.
I think that's why it lasted. I mean, if it stuck to its guns and was a straight hardcore superhero TV show, we see what happens with those type of shows. They only last maybe a season at best, or 2. But when they got the guys like me to watch because it's Superman, but then they got their wives to watch because they wanted to see the love triangle, the rom-com aspect of it, it get doubled its audience. You get your wife and you watch the show, that's doubling your audience. So it lasted, I know, for 4 years, and I know they had the dreaded season where they got Superman and Lois finally got married, and then once they got married, the whole thing kind of bottomed out because most of the people who were watching it were seeing will they, won't they, and when they finally got married, it was like, okay, they're married. So I know the show bottomed out and the ratings disappeared, and it disappeared. It kind of just like left off the air. I mean, I remember just turning one time and I thought Lois and Clark should be on at this time, and it wasn't on anymore. This is before the internet where you knew about TV shows being canceled, so it just wasn't on anymore. But I do remember the show, and I do remember liking the show for what it was and not being overly excited about the show, but still appreciating the show for what it was.
So there were a lot of other series in the 90s that brought in a lot of fantasy elements because we had Hercules, The Legendary Journeys, Young Hercules, Xena. There was Highlander the Raven, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There were a lot of them that were just more fantasy. So in sci-fi, although a lot of these had sci-fi elements, so we're just going to leave those to the side. But there's one that we were talking about before we started recording that I did want to bring up, and it was RoboCop the series.
Go ahead and shock the flat line, then let's quit.
Okay, everybody clear.
Officer Alex Murphy shot to death in the line of duty.
Legally, he's dead. We can pretty much do what we want.
There's a new guy in town. His name's RoboCop.
So it obviously has a lot of sci-fi elements, considering it's based on a cybernetic police officer in Detroit of the future. But it ran for 21 episodes, ran on Sci-Fi Network, from what I remember, and it was originally made as a Canadian production. But you mentioned you were just talking about that not too long ago with a friend.
Yeah, I was talking about the movies. I remember they did the RoboCop movies, and I was talking about the TV show. I remember they tried to capture the satire of the movie in the TV show. I remember it wasn't a bad show. It was a pretty decent show. It was pretty good visual effects. I think they replicated the suit, if I remember correctly. Not as violent, definitely not as violent. That was the thing that they took out of the show that really hurt the show a lot, I think, is that they tried to make RoboCop a PG hero. And here's a character who's a police officer who has a gun, but he never shot anybody. He would shoot the chandelier and drop it on people's head, or he would shoot the fire hydrant and it would squirt water on people.
And that's coming after the 87 version where we see Paul Vanderhoven basically turn him into like a killing machine.
Yeah, I mean, he was
going after all these criminals, and then they convert him into this like non-lethal criminal deterrent in the TV series.
I mean, they tried to do the best they could with the show, and it was okay. I remember his arch nemesis was Putface Morgan. He's basically the Joker. He was this villain that RoboCop fought, and he accidentally fell into these excess chemicals, and his face would look like clay. He had a big rubber clay nose. It kind of looked like Jimmy Durante, if anybody who remembers that reference. He had the big clay nose, and that was his name, Putface Morgan, and he was this arch criminal who kept popping up, and RoboCop would have to smack him down. If you remember the movie, they had a lot of satire in the movie, and they had this one thing in the movie where they had this character, Commander Cash. He was just commercials that they had in there that they tried to capture some of the satirical commercials like the SUX and
that's something Vanderhoven, like he did that in
Total Recall, Starship Troopers.
Yeah, Paul Vanderhoven did something similar in Starship Troopers. But all those commercials, like I'd buy that for $1.
Yeah, and I remember they had the commercials they had with the Commander Cash character, the animated little commercials that they tried to throw in there. One time they actually had Roddy Piper play the character of Commander Cash in the TV series. He thought he was Commander. He went crazy, thought he was Commander Cash, and I remember that was funny to see Roddy Piper in his outfit in the Commander Cash outfit from the TV show. But it was a decent series, except for the fact that they really tried to stay away from the violence, which I think really hurt the show, because you would see RoboCop with a gun and he would never shoot anybody.
Peter Weller.
No Peter Weller.
They actually tried to negotiate with him to bring him into the series, but they wound up with actor Richard Eden, who did an okay job, considering that all your acting is basically you by your face, mouth. Yeah. And the original pilot, Corporate Wars, was actually written by the two guys who wrote the original script for the original 1987 movie, and they had a lot of different villains. But I think what I remember from the TV series is that OCP wasn't really as malicious. They were more kind of like comic relief. They were more bumbling and kind of like naive and ignorant. Yeah. Versus the movie version where they were more malicious and wanted to
corporate superpower.
Corporate superpower, taking advantage of military contracts and trying to make money off of it. I mean, perfect 90s Wall Street kind of stuff, but kind of lost that along, like you said, with the level of graphic violence that was in the movie. Yeah. That, even if you're not a fan of violence, that's a piece of what made RoboCop.
I mean, not that the violence in RoboCop was the only thing that was going. It was a great movie. The violence in the movie was just there, but when he tried so hard to pull that violence out, like you said, with OCP, instead of making them this malicious corporate entity, they try to make them these kooky business guys who try to have these world domination plans, mellowed the show out. But as I remember the show, it was decent.
I say, as cheesy as all these shows were, at least they opened the door for the early 2000 superhero TV shows like Mutant X, The Tick, Black Scorpion, Witchblade, Birds of Prey, Blade, and Smallville. And those really opened the doors to more recent TV shows like Alphas, The Cape, Arrow, The Flash, Supergirl, Legends of Tomorrow, Constantine, Gotham, Agent Carter, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., let alone all the more adult Netflix shows like Daredevil, Luke Cage, Jessica Jones, and Iron Fist. But we had to live through the 90s, through The Flash, and through Mantis, and through the RoboCop series in order to get some of these. So as easily as forgotten as they are, and very much a product of their time as they are, it's nice to just take a step back and remember the roots of all of these shows, because we still get the mad scientists, the criminal syndicates, the mob bosses, and the villains of the week. It's just maybe we like to think we're a bit more mature.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar. It's a similar process with the movies. I mean, you look at some of the movies, how the movies progress with, Supergirl and Shaquille O'Neal playing Steel, and some of those really bad 80s and 90s superhero movies that come out, and you look at what they are then, and you look at movies like Civil War and Winter Soldier and Guardians of the Galaxy, and you look how amazing these movies are, but those really bad movies and those so-so movies like a Swamp Thing had to come out to pave the way for the Blades and the Spider-Mans and stuff like that. So it's pretty good to go look back and see what worked and what didn't work, because that laid the ground for what's working right now.
Yes, I think there's absolutely no reason whatsoever to have a podcast dedicated to Shaquille O'Neal's steel. So maybe we'll never talk about that.
Well, we disagree on that. So we just agree to disagree.
I'd say tune in, folks, but I don't think we're going to do that.
That's it for this episode. Tune in next time for more fan-to-fan conversations on the Fan-to-Fan podcast. Thanks for listening.
Death, sudden, violent, and horrible, lurking in the shadows.